Hi everybody, welcome back. Another video for you. As always, there's way more to cover than there is time for, so I will plug, as always, my Patreon page, patreon.com/Eric Draitzer. There's a lot more content that doesn't get posted here that you can find over there if you are interested, and thank you to those who have already supported me there. Okay, I want to talk about a couple of different things today in the time that I have, which is limited. I want to begin by talking about a very dominant sort of narrative that exists within the social media space and generally within the mainstream discourse. And that is the question of what is going to happen with the skies over Ukraine, and specifically the calls for a no-fly zone. I have heard this from many different people. Obviously, those who are on the ground in Ukraine, including President Zelensky himself, have openly and repeatedly and forcefully called for a no-fly zone. I think one can understand, where they're coming from. Obviously, their lives are on the line. The Russian control of the skies is a problem for them, etc. So they have a self-interested reason here, and they, of course, have all the sort of motivation in the world to want to encourage this. But for those of us who are outside of Ukraine, we also have an obligation to think very clearly about what the implications are of doing this. First of all, what a no-fly zone is, how it is, how it is enforced, how it is established, and what the potential consequences are. And I think that we do have an obligation to each other and to our children and to the entire human race to really think very carefully about what escalation in this conflict might look like, given how dynamic everything is. So let's just talk very quickly about a no-fly zone and where, at least I can explain where my position on this comes from. Now, my understanding, based on my memory and very quick sort of background research on this, no-fly zones are fairly recent phenomenon. They are, as far as I recall, Iraq and the NATO bombing of Serbia and Libya are the prime examples of no-fly zones. And if we think about what a no-fly zone means, it means it's not, it's not sanctions. It's not something that exists on paper. It's a real thing in the real world that involves actual pilots going up into the air and engaging with the so-called enemy force in potentially exchange of fire or whatever it might be. But that's only part of it. You also have, as part of the establishment of a no-fly zone, offensive actions aimed at airfields, offensive actions aimed at radar facilities and other logistics locations that are critical for air power for the country that is being blocked from flying. So in this case, if we were to have a NATO no-fly zone, you would have NATO jets, NATO pilots engaging Russian pilots over the skies of Ukraine, with all of the unpredictable ramifications that that would carry, up to and including an escalation of exchanges that, of course, then brings up the question of nuclear exchange. So I think that we have to think about that. We also have to think about the fact that the establishment of a no-fly zone historically has been the prelude to war. If you recall how it was done in Libya, it was done overnight. First, the UN authorizes the no-fly zone, and literally within hours, the United States, the French, and the British are bombing targets in Libya. Okay, so how does one establish a no-fly zone without establishing participation in a war? I don't believe that's actually possible. I believe a no-fly zone is a clear act of war. It is an act of war that not only escalates the current situation, but injects a level of unpredictability into it that is very, very dangerous. Again, I think that a lot of Western liberals and others who have been crying for a no-fly zone seem to be under some kind of illusion or fantasy that Vladimir Putin himself is piloting each of these jets. He is not. These are humans. These are regular human beings. Some of them get nervous, get anxious, maybe get scared, whatever it might be. Things happen in the heat of war, in the heat of these kind of moments that can't be taken back. And if Russian pilots start getting shot out of the air, shot out of the skies, how do we think Russia is going to respond to that? I mean, obviously, there's the threat of escalation with NATO, but there's also the threat of escalation within Ukraine. I mean, do you think that the Russians are just going to sit back and allow their pilots to be shot out of the skies? I don't think so. We need to be very careful at thinking about what a no-fly zone means. And again, just like with sanctions, it is war by other means. Yes, it is not officially invading a country, but it is, in effect, taking control of their skies, using your military, and simultaneously preventing their ability to respond. That is aggression. That is war. So, does this mean that Russia isn't engaging in a war crime in Ukraine? It most certainly is. Everything that Russia has done is a war crime. They are guilty of some of the supreme crimes, according to the Nuremberg precedents, a crime against peace, a crime against the general peace. Of course, the United States is guilty of that 10 times over. But that doesn't mean that we in the West or really anywhere should have illusions about what a no-fly zone means. A no-fly zone means we are escalating and expanding this war. And if you are anti-war, if you are anti-imperialist, if you believe that we should not be extending the global hegemony of the United States and its empire, nor should we be towing the line of a criminal regime in Moscow and its imperial revanchism, if you believe in peace, you can't support a no-fly zone. You can't support escalation of a conflict that could spin out of control and threaten all of us. I'm sorry, this is just not acceptable. This is not an anti-war position. This is not an anti-imperialist position. This is a liberal warmongering position, and it must be rejected. All right, I want to talk very quickly about another interesting piece that I came across from the RAND Corporation. Now, if you know the RAND Corporation, this is one of the premier think tanks of the military-industrial complex. It is, in many ways, at the heart of sort of the brains, the strategic planners, and others behind what the empire does. And so when the RAND Corporation speaks, it speaks with the voice of at least a segment of the intelligence community, a segment of the military-industrial complex. And the RAND Corporation had a very interesting piece that essentially, it was a short piece, but it essentially put forward a proposal for how to move forward given the nature of the events on the ground. And it was pretty sober in its analysis. And I have to say, going off of what I was just mentioning about the no-fly zone, this RAND Corporation article is much more sensible than most of the liberal stuff I've come across. All kinds of calls for expansion of war from so-called Democrats and liberals and progressives and others. I reject all of this. I'm much more closely aligned with whoever it was that wrote this at the RAND Corporation. So let's talk about 4 key points that they mention in this RAND Corporation piece that I think are critical. Basically, the point is that the Russians have already invaded. They've committed a war crime. This is very clear. However, just because that has already happened and can't be undone, it doesn't mean that the United States should be blundering its way into a confrontation. And so point number 1 of this RAND Corporation proposal, and this, I would just say before I even get into this, I think some of the logic behind this is really rooted in some of the more sensible, conclusions that were drawn from the Cold War, namely the idea that information is critical and information exchange is critical in order to avoid conflict. So, point number 1 in the RAND Corporation proposal: maintain channels of communication. The United States and its partners are doing everything to essentially cut off communication with the Russians. One can only hope that at least at the military level and the sort of strategic level, that they do have some kind of communication open, whether it's simply a telephone line like back in the days of the Cold War, or whether it's other forms of communication, that somehow or another information is still being exchanged and hopefully cooler heads are speaking to each other. The second point that they make, and I guess this sort of relates to the first one, is about transparency about troop movements. If there is any arming of the Ukrainian military by the United States and NATO and its partners, whether it's, regional partners like Poland or others, that there needs to be transparency with the Russians about what's happening, what's moving, where it's going, etc. This is not to say that that you give away confidential information or anything. It is to create a level of trust and transparency between the Russian side and the NATO side, that, look, yes, we are doing this, but here, you can see what we're doing, you can see what we're moving, you can see where we're moving it to, etc. If the Russians feel that there is a lot of sort of mysterious movements about equipment, personnel, etc., they might take preemptive measures and preventive action and do whatever they might need to do to protect themselves against what they may correctly or incorrectly perceive to be a major threat. So having that level of transparency is going to be critical. And I'm sorry to those people who want to put on blue and gold pom-poms and cheerlead for war here and cheerlead for an expansion of this conflict. But this is the way that we're going to avoid allowing this to spill over into the rest of Europe and into the rest of the world. This is really critical, and I would urge people to take these things very, very seriously. The third one that the RAND Corporation suggested is sanctions relief, which, of course, I mean, it seems like it would go without saying, but using sanctions and concessions over the sanctions as a means of leveraging Putin to the negotiating table. I think everybody understands that while, like as I said on my video last night, Russia does have economic counter responses, economic weapons of its own that it can use. Russia's getting battered. The stock market, it doesn't really exist right now in Russia because it will just crash the minute, the minute everything sort of opens up completely. Russia is suffering. Economically, it's going to suffer. Whether or not Russia can endure, the Russian people and the Russian state can endure that suffering longer than the West, that remains to be seen. It remains to be seen how long this might go. But either way, sanctions relief, particularly sanctions on the banks, this is really, I think, critical. There are all kinds of ways that Russia is facing sanctions now, but probably one of the most potent are the sanctions that are on the Russian central bank, which then makes it very difficult for Russia to access its reserves, to get cash, to dollars, et cetera, all of those different things. So if sanctions relief, particularly on the central bank, can be put on the table, then you might actually be able to get some movement in a negotiation. If we see the Russians continually walking away from the negotiating table, or conversely, the Ukrainians walking away from the negotiating table, what are we supposed to do? What are we supposed to think other than this conflict, this war is going to drag on and on and on and kill more and more and more Ukrainians, to say nothing of the Russian soldiers and, their families and stuff back home who are, I think a lot of them blindsided by this. So the sanctions relief is a big piece of this. And the fourth point that they make, and I'm against it, but I think it should be made clear. The fourth point is about arming of the Ukrainian military forces and the various militia groups, some of them Nazis, of course, and that the United States and NATO, if it is going to do any arming of these forces, must be extremely careful in how it does that. I will just say again, to be very clear, I am 100% against sending arms into a war like this because of the nature of what's going to happen to those arms after they enter into the conflict zone. But leaving that aside, if there were to be arming of the Ukrainians, this has to be done essentially covertly. It has to be done secretly. That's what the RAND Corporation is saying, because again, if you rub it in the faces of the Russians that you are arming the military that they are fighting, they will then escalate. You see, it's not just about Russia being some kind of evil, fascist sort of military force. Russia also has extremely rational thinkers who will see certain moves and will respond to those moves accordingly. So we need to be mindful of that. Okay, last couple of minutes I have here. I want to talk very briefly about food. I did mention it in the video that I did last night, but I think we should talk about it again. Between Russia and Ukraine, and I mean, there's so many different commodities and things that we can point to, but I'm just going to talk about wheat. Between Russia and Ukraine, they make up a huge chunk of the global wheat supply. Many articles have been already written about how this is going to impact global food prices, global food insecurity, et cetera, especially in the global south. So I just want to talk very quickly about a few countries that are right at the top of the list of Ukrainian wheat importers. Okay, so again, just to reiterate, there will be no wheat coming out of Ukraine for a couple of reasons. Number one, nobody's there to plant it right now. The war is disrupting what would be the very beginning of planting season, or I guess, a few weeks before planting season. Secondly, there will likely be no port to export from. The primary port in Ukraine, the city of Odessa, that is, well, although it hasn't been bombed quite yet, there's a good chance that that port will no longer be under the control of the Ukrainians. Moreover, that port will not be able to export anything in the near future. So if that's the case, and you have all of that wheat, both Russian and Ukrainian, taken out of the global market because of the destruction of the port in Ukraine and also because of sanctions on Russia, you will see major spikes in the price of wheat and the various other products, bread and so forth. And again, just to reiterate, it's not just bread we're talking about and things of that nature. We're also talking about food for livestock. So you'll see that coming forward in the prices of meat and other animal products, et cetera. So, there's a lot of sort of elements to that. But here, let's just talk about four of the biggest importers of wheat from Ukraine. One that is just an never-ending tragedy is the country of Yemen. Yemen, if you follow the issues in Yemen and the Saudis, I guess genocidal war in Yemen is probably the best way we could describe it. War of extermination. Yemen is one of the poorest countries in the world, one of the most food insecure in the world. There has already been famine in Yemen due to the blockade imposed by the Saudis and their U.S. partners. So the fact is that Yemen is already more or less, if they're not officially in famine, they teeter on the brink of famine. And so now, without these imports, what does that mean for the poor people of Yemen? Similarly, this is another country where we need to pay attention to how this is going to impact everything is Ethiopia. There was a couple of years ago, is it 2 years ago now? My goodness. When the rhetoric was starting to heat up from Ethiopia and the Prime Minister Abiy Ahmed, regarding the Tigray forces, the TPLF, which ultimately has led to the war between the Ethiopian government and the TPLF forces. When this was beginning, there was sort of a statement made by Ahmed about wanting to reject wheat food imports, food aid from the United States. And, this raised the question of what exactly he was getting at. Is this because the Ethiopians have moved closer to the Chinese? Is this just some practical concern? It was a move that was widely reported and mostly forgotten once the war between Ethiopia and Tigray began. But here we are now in 2022, and Ethiopia is still a major importer of Ukrainian wheat. What is going to happen now? How is this going to impact the conflict? It's a simmering conflict now to some extent, but how is it going to impact this? Are the authorities in Ethiopia going to ensure that this now much more precious wheat gets distributed equitably, or are we going to see a possibility of the renewal of the conflict being sort of fomented by rising food prices? Ethiopia is close to the Chinese. It remains to be seen whether they'll be able to still get Russian wheat via sort of Chinese middlemen? A lot of questions remain there. Egypt, I believe 80% of Egypt's wheat supply is from Ukraine. I think that's the number. I could be wrong about that, but it's a huge percentage. Egypt has been scrambling in recent months as the conflict, as the conflict with Ukraine began to come into full view, even before the war. Egypt was looking to diversify, looking to sign deals with other wheat producing countries. It remains to be seen how successful they're going to be, because again, it will not be known just yet. It's going to be known 6 months from now, when the global market and the global prices start to reflect this disruption. So Egypt is a major one. Again, that is one of the most influential, most significant countries in the Arab world, and something of a trendsetter politically and in other ways as well. Remember, food prices were what food and inflation and things like this, these economic issues, these were some of the driving forces behind the Arab Spring, especially in places like Syria, where the protests really did begin because of price hikes. So there's a lot of political dynamics around that. And the last one I want to mention is another country that has been dealing with an economic and political crisis for several years, and this will undoubtedly exacerbate some of these problems, and that is Lebanon. Lebanon, if you follow that country, you know that Lebanon has been dealing with this ongoing crisis now for several years. Multiple governments have fallen, endemic corruption, and a more or less collapsing or collapsed economy. And so what's going to happen now, when people already can't afford the essentials of daily life in Lebanon, and now all of a sudden the price of food is going to skyrocket? So there's a lot to think about with regard to the Ukraine Russia war that goes well beyond issues related to Ukraine and Russia. So anyway, I don't know why my voice is going, but I guess that's my cue to be done. Thank you so much. Go to the Patreon page, a lot more there, patreon.com/Eric Draitser. Talk to you again next time.